In the meantime, Frank had on standby many of the poor from the tenements round about to move into the houses that were now vacated. So there was no case of a vacuum. It wasn't just an empty, deserted area. He got all the poor. They said, have your stuff ready, the day after tomorrow, you're moving in. And they did. And he changed the whole area, put up a lovely crucifix and a statue of the Sacred Heart in the area, and transformed the entire district. And he said it was probably the greatest apostolic conversion, since the Acts of the Apostles, the great mass conversion of an entire red light district. Just extraordinary. So if you read the book, it's just, Frank always reckoned there was a tunnel, an escape tunnel out of there, and he thought he discovered it later on. There's so many people dignitaries and everything used to use the area. It was a real big challenge to take it on, a huge challenge, because he was up against the police, even the clergy, and probably up against government officials too, who used to go to the place, So that was kind of the beginning of the Legion history, and just, the miracles just flowed after that. So those two priests, Father Creedon and Father Toher, were very much involved in that whole campaign to bring about conversion there. So shortly after that then, in 1927, a hostel was begun for homeless men and destitute men. And it wasn't just a place where they could stay, they were also given a bit of work to do. In 1925, Frank wrote a brilliant dissertation, I think for the government, on the problem of the down and out. It's a brilliant piece of writing, very insightful. He looks at the problem and he turns it inside out, and then he suggests a way of approach. And you notice this in the handbook too. This is the handbook approach to our Legion work. That nothing is impossible. Just take that first step, analyze it, break it down, and just move forward. So he began that hostel for homeless men, and then shortly afterwards, 1930, I think, the Regina Coeli hostel began as well for homeless women and their children. And these two hostels, Regina Coeli and the Morning Star Hostel for men and women, are both situated in the same avenue, Morning Star Avenue, next to Frank Duff's house. They're all there together, and both these hostels are still running and still doing tremendous work. You can see Frank here surrounded by children. He loves children, and you see that quote there that Frank said to Mary Rowe, a legionary in the Regina Coeli, that if Frank himself, if he ever got married, he'd probably lose his religion. He would be so intensely wrapped up in the children. He loved children dearly. Then it seems amazing why he never got married. It's as if, the Legion was his calling almost. Although he did say later on, somebody asked him why he never got married. He said, well, better maybe to keep, a dozen women in hopeful anticipation than one woman miserable all her life, That was his stock answer maybe to that. But the Legion begins to grow and grow and grow, all under the leadership of Frank Duff. Now this is around 1930, and in the early days it spread around 1928 to Glasgow, then to England, and then it began to really blossom. And India was one of the first foreign countries that it began into. This lady was travelling out to India, and Frank met her, and she joined the Legion and understood it and took it to India, one of the first envoys, if you like, to start the Legion abroad. And then things start to snowball. The hostels were going at this time. Frank was working in the civil service still at this time. He was still in the St. Vincent de Paul Society at this time, and the Legion was blossoming. And he's trying to run these hostels, and his life was being run at a hectic pace. You see any of his letters of those days, and he's up till 2, 3, 4 a.m., and he reaches 3 a.m., he's finished his letters, and then he has to say his office. Then he has to get up from Mass, and then start all over again, and go to work. And the pace of his work was just exhausting, and how he survived it is miraculous even in itself. And the Legion just spread and spread. Here's Veronica O'Brien, lady next to Frank Duff. She's actually from my parish in Middleton. She grew up in the house across the road. She was an envoy to France during the war years and did tremendous work to spread the Legion around France. She even went to Turkey and Greece as well. And she, in the end, became almost a spiritual directress to Cardinal Sunens. Remember, Cardinal Sunens wrote the book on Edel Quinn, and he was a tremendous lover of the Legion in his own right. And she and Cardinal Sunens really hit it off and became strong spiritual acquaintances, I suppose through their joint love of the Legion. Again, Father Creedon and Father Toher, these are like early pioneers. These are the early Legion saints, really, all of these people. Frank used to get around on his bicycle. He drove his brother's car once, and it exploded. So he said, all right, that's it, that's my driving career over. and stuck to his bike. And he cycled everywhere around Dublin, and even in his leisure time he used to cycle around Ireland and go off photographing the scenery around Ireland. On his bicycle he used to keep a little miraculous medal just somewhere on the handlebars there in the front to remind him of Our Lady. On his camera he had a little statue of Our Lady on the top of the camera, so that every time, I don't know how he had it worked, but every time he looked through the viewfinder he'd see Our Lady. He'd always be reminded. And in his breviary he used to keep an image of Our Lady, and sticking out of the top of the book he'd keep that picture of Our Lady, again to remind him of Our Lady. Simple things, but this love sort of coming through in simple ways. So his bicycle was his trusty steed. You can see there's a lead coming out of the lapel of his coat. He was deaf in one ear. When he was about 12, he was in a cricket match, and the ball hit him and knocked him out, hit him above the ear, and he lost his hearing for the most part in one ear. And it was a terrible impediment throughout his life. He had several operations to try to cure it, and all kinds of gadgets and things to try to help him, but not to much avail. He was a great lover of gadgets and things too. He used to dictate his letters. He wrote as many as, now we haven't counted them, but at least 32,000 letters. And they're not short, like one page, hello, how are you, the weather's fine, goodbye now. It's like 6 pages of densely typed. These are huge letters, all of them. And there's at least 32,000 of them. So we have like 400 binders of letters filed. And somebody's got to sit down and, it's going to take forever to just read the letters alone. But they're full of his apostolic zeal and concern for others. He always made people the center of attention anytime he was in a group of people. Many of his friends would testify to that. So his group of cyclists, he called them the Sprockets, and they used to cycle around Ireland. Here he is. This is probably his later years, really. And they'd just head off on the bike, go into the mountains, find a bed and breakfast or something to stay in. And on the way, they do plenty of contact work. And they met lots of foreigners and visitors to Ireland and, give a miraculous medal, try to encourage their faith. Always on duty, legionaries, always on duty, but he was able to have his fun too. So there he is in 57. But you can imagine in his own mind now, he's thinking South America. Alfie Lambe is doing great work out there. He's probably thinking Russia even. Can we extend to Russia? He's thinking China. All those martyrs we've had out in China. How is Father McGrath doing? Is he still in prison at that time? How are all my legionaries? In China, Mao Zedong referred to Frank Duff as public enemy number one, that the Legion was the enemy, because from the communist perspective, it was organized in a similar way to communism. Little cell groups who met together, they received the doctrine, and then they went out disseminating that doctrine wherever they could. And the Legion was exactly like that. So you read stories about this, some brilliant stories, books written about priests and sisters and people who were imprisoned in China for being in the Legion of Mary. They were sent into prison and tortured horribly. And Dries Van Colley wrote a book, Brainwashed in Peking, it's called. And you'd be exhausted after reading the book, because he goes through the daily communist brainwashing in the prison cell. And typically the communist guards would take him out and interview him, torture him, and say, "Who is this Mary? Who is she? We want to know. She's part of that imperialist, American, anti-Chinese, whatever, you name it. This idea that it was a subversive organization. They just missed out on the whole spiritual thrust of the Legion. So you can imagine 1957, all this is going on in Frank's mind. Not to mention all the many thousands of letters he would have been writing, contact with the whole planet, really. Extraordinary. So here he is again in the 50s with Maria Deep, and remember Maria's a German envoy. She was sent out with Alfie Lambe. Remember we saw a picture of her out in Rio de Janeiro, and her mission work was in the northern countries of South America. And this is taken just outside the door of the Regia Coeli hostel. And it looks pretty much the same today, that red brick building. Lots of homeless women still there. And these great legionaries, I've met some of the legionaries working in the Morning Star now. I know some in the Regia Coeli too, but really they're saints. I just take my hat off to them, because the men that come in there, they house about 100 men in a dormitory of a given night, and they're there at the gate, and they have to confiscate the alcohol they're carrying, and get them in, try and get them to take a shower. They have a chapel inside in the hostel, and they invite them in, and a priest comes in a Saturday night for confessions. They invite them down to pray the rosary, to come down to Mass. They try to reach the men, not just at the physical level, to feed them and clothe them and clean them, but at the spiritual level too. And the men, the indoor brothers there, it's fantastic self-sacrifice, you know, just because they have to take a lot of abuse, a lot of stick from time to time. I mean, Frank describes it himself in his own writings. He says there's no evening in either of the hostels, even if it's a quiet evening, which is not without its spirit of adventure, because you're wondering, well, what's going to happen next? You know, who's going to throw a fit or who's going to lose the head? So those hostels still going on today. Here's Frank giving a talk on Edel Quinn, and there was no doubt in Frank's mind that she's a saint. And he writes very fittingly of her too, and of her zeal and dedication, and you know, her promptness going to Africa and yet dying of tuberculosis. And then Frank's own vision. She herself wrote to Frank on the voyage. I think her first letter she sent to Frank, she said, look, you know that what your decision to send me to Africa is right. The others, they'll understand later. You know, that she and he were obviously at this sort of level of insight that God